to spend a day or two on the range within the military and law enforcement. A lot of times, what happens is the requirements are what drives everything. So imagine with everything going on, with all of the social changes that we have within society, all those things, they start to reduce time. So there is a finite amount of time, money, and manning available. That's the underlying condition of going on with training. So as we start to add more requirements, what happens is that starts to divert our attention to other areas. So commanders, they don't, or decision makers, they just don't have the necessarily, they don't have that bandwidth to start pushing people in every single which direction, or to put a priority on focus, because they have an obligation to meet a broad set of skills and a broad set of requirements. So that is typically the main driver. So, as far as people developing higher levels of skill, what tends to happen is that people don't really go beyond a familiarization phase. They kind of get introduced to a skill. And what happens is, because someone has never learned that skill before, they tend to think, well, I've learned this because I went from zero to knowing what this thing is. So I've learned the skill. And also within organizations is that everything is driven by liability. So the idea that we're going to take these, we'll call them, we'll call it that the organizations are risk adverse. So when you tell them to do things like, well, we're going to put you within distance, and we're going to use projectile, non-lethal training aids, projectiles at each other. Someone who doesn't understand, they're looking at that as unnecessarily risky, and it's scary to them in a lot of ways. They're like, look, again, going back to that money, manning, and time being limited. I don't want to risk my manning by having somebody get injured in training. And one of the reasons why boxing kind of went away in the military was, well, for every 200,000 exposures, we have one death. So imagine you're training a million man army, and you have, that's going to be 5 deaths annually just from training. And it's something that we just can't tolerate. So let's talk about what drives civilians. So, for the most part, personal safety, that's going to be your main driver. People in the civilian world, if you ever heard of this idea that men don't really have a guy they can call at 3 in the morning, or the idea of the death of bowling, that comes down to people not having very many close friends. People understand that they are on their own and they're alone, and they're feeling the effect of that. And so they know it's up to them to produce some type of resistance against an external force. And the other thing with the civilian training is that, or for the civilian context, is the day will choose you. You don't get to decide when you're going to be in that fight. It's not this assaulting objective that, this kind of military fantasy. It's like when you really think about the problem, you understand that you are going to be at a reactionary deficit, and these people, they may be, you know there may be more than one. They may have weapons, you don't know. So there's so many unknown variables, especially with what's uncovered in the media, um, through YouTube, through Instagram, through the news and media at large, that we can see exactly what happens within scenarios to make good judgment as far as what kind of problems we're typically going to face. Now, the other thing with civilian training that is different, or what civilian motivations, is that they're looking for some type of empowerment. Okay, I mean it's sad but true that less than 1% of Americans have served in the military. And what happened in the old days, that was your kind of your rite of passage. If you didn't have already kind of something within the family that was already a rite of passage, it was like, this is, you are a man. And now, with everything going on with public schools, especially shaming boys for for pursuing things that are masculine. A lot of people they grow up in these office environments and they're looking for something to kind of feel the sense of power and respect within themselves. And that's just men. For women especially, also um, they're looking they're women are kind of almost taught like they have to kind of become their own um how can I say this politely? They almost have to become the men they wanted to marry because like a lot of the men that they're chasing just they're not there and they're just unreliable. So women are taking more and more responsibility for themselves in terms of um, their own personal safety. They're not reliant on men. They're strong and independent these days. So that extends from this, when more women are graduating, they're getting more college education than men. They're earning more in the workplace. They're getting higher power positions. So they they're now also taking into their personal safety into account as well. And it's also, to be fair, people like me, we're also pushing it on them as far as like this is something that you should and need to do. Um, see if there's any comments, guys. If you have any comments or questions, concerns, just go ahead put them in the chat. I'll be checking it periodically as I speak. Okay. Now, so it's a lot very, very different in terms of military and law enforcement. So when someone signs up for an open enrollment class, they want the material there. They've put their time, they put their money, they've been thinking about doing this for several years or months or whatever, however an extended period of time, and they're invested in it, and since they're putting their own money and their own time, they've got skin in the game. So when they go up to these courses, they're showing up, they're motivated, they're positive, they're open-minded, they have chosen this expert and they have become very invested in it. They have a different level of commitment. Okay. Now, it's counterintuitive, but people believe, well, if this person is in the military or they're law enforcement, that they are drawn to combative or combative training. They're pugnacious, meaning combative in nature, and that's not necessarily true. Um, People join the police and military force for all kinds of reasons. A lot of it sometimes comes down to that it's been a passion of them to not starve to death. So they need a way to make a living. And those things, I think a lot of times people forget about that. Not everyone aspires to be a warrior. I was when I was training and I was going to jujitsu school when I first started back in, I don't know, I think 2008. I was in a 600 person battalion. And how many people trained in that battalion? One, me. So, and this is something that I've seen a lot through mentors and across. I mean, now things are a little bit different. I think now you have maybe a little bit more. You'll have a handful. You'll have a local jujitsu club on base or something to that effect. But again, right, jujitsu isn't necessarily combatives. It's a component. And the component that the jujitsu plays is just live ground grappling. It's not necessarily the sum of combatives. It's just a piece. So the other thing is that people need to understand that once you're in the military and once you're in the police force, getting promotions, advancement, favorable action, those aren't necessarily aligned with uh, combative expertise. So within public institutions, it's like, being a skilled combatant kind of, and a lot of times it takes a back seat to being collaborative. It's hard to that while combatives is a hard skill as we think about it, it's still hard to measure. All right, in a lot of ways, people don't really have an objective way to give their bosses some kind of um, ammo, so that way when they go and they ask for funding, when they go and they ask for money or they ask for training or they ask for certain things in terms of producing this type of person. Um, you have the guys who are really, really invested in training that they don't really supply them that income. They don't really give them what they need. They don't have a way of articulating, well, I have improved X amount of percent, or I've trained X amount of people, or I've logged any of these hours. Those are the metrics that your leadership needs from you. So that way they can go ahead and ask for money and fight on your behalf. Now, the other side of this, and I know a lot of people aren't crazy about it, but you've got to, the politics of it really requires that you are um, essentially giving them what they need so they can advance as well. Okay, because the people in the leadership, they're living and working out of their office all the time, so they need to say like, my look how cool my guys are, look how great my guys are, look at the impact and the results that my guys are having, locally, abroad, whatever it is, wherever your operational focus is. The metrics and some type of results, those things matter, and we've got to get better about articulating those things. If your boss looks at what you're doing and it looks like your hobby, it's they're not going to be happy with that, because again, their drawing and their thinking, their frame of reference about training is that money, manning, and time are all limited. I have X amount of hours to dedicate towards this. Why would I allocate more time, more money to this specific area? And it's because they don't understand that the firearms piece is integrated there, right? A lot of times, so this is why I made it a point to mention jujitsu being a part of it and not the sum. Because what happens is, typically what we see with combatives is people will automatically associate jujitsu with that. And if you've been working on some type of fire maneuver, right? Armed movement and structures, a room clearing, you're standing, walking around, moving with a weapon in hand, and all of a sudden the training goes from that to, now we're going to go ahead and roll on the ground. It's disconnected, and people don't understand how those things support one another. So it's very difficult to sell the idea that, hey, we need to do more of this, as opposed to, well, we can refine these things, right? Because look, the whole combatives as we know it. All right, let's talk about modern combatives training. It came out of, hey, sir, we think this is a big waste of time, and clearly, making people within an institution learn how to fight is not a waste of time. What we're doing is, so instead of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, we have to find a better way. So I think when you start to take your training and take what your unit or your organization wants, and you start to mix those things together and make it in a way where the ideal member of that organization is being produced by the program, those are the things that start to make sense. And those are the things that your leadership looks on and like, wow, okay, this actually has real value. And I think a lot of times that um, we get caught up, and I've seen this a lot with a lot of other combatives instructors and just programs in general. They get caught up in the hand-to-hand combat piece. Actually, let me back up a step. They actually don't even connect the combat piece to the hand-to-hand. Okay, and one of the issues we run into is that defining combatives. Okay, and combatives is referred to as hand-to-hand combat. But to define that appropriately, we should go back and look at that word of combat. What does combat mean? And if you go and find this definition of combat, it is defined as conflict between armed forces. So, if conflict between armed forces is combat and combatives is hand-to-hand combat, then then the implication is there that there are the use of arms. And if we're talking about if we're talking about hand to hand, then we should be that there's an implication there as well, that we're talking about being within arm's reach, having weapons, And that changes things dramatically from a standard jujitsu training method. Um, so those are the things that that kind of eat at me when we start talking about combatives training, and then this is why we have so many so much contention and pushback within organizations. It isn't just a risk. There's more to it than that. It isn't just the incentives. It's definitely that's definitely part of it. Okay. There's definitely more than one battle to be fought. But what we got to do is really paint the right picture. And if we paint the right picture, a lot of those things will start to fall into place. All right. So all right, guys. That's pretty much all I've got there. If you've got any questions, comments, concerns, go ahead and leave them in here. I'm gonna upload this as a podcast, and you can find it on my YouTube channel, or you'll be able to find it on Spotify. All right. Take care, guys.